Okay. Hello. Good morning and welcome back for our panel. As you come in, please take a seat. We're going to get started out of respect to our panelists and the rest of the audience. I am Laura Lorenzoni. I'm with NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and I'm a member of the Ocean Ops 19 program committee. It is my honor to host this distinguished panel today and to have this wonderful panelist with us. The topic of our panel today is going to center around how we can transform and deliver ocean observing data into practical and applicable information. Our panelists will help us today investigate these opportunities and challenges. What are the current realities, some of the barriers, and how do we overcome them? Let me first introduce our panel. Dr. Mike Fedak got his PhD in animal physiology and the mechanics and energetics of animal locomotion, which sounds quite interesting and remarkable. He joined the Sea Mammal Research Unit in 1979 to develop ways to understand the energetics of sea mammals and the life history processes. He then went on to apply these studies in different areas, and his research evidenced the need to gather information on where the animals actually lived in the ocean rather than just on land. And so this actually provides a better understanding of the foraging and distribution of these marine animals. In 1999, he was appointed as a professor at the University of St. Andrews, where he remained until he retired, and I am very jealous, in 2008. So thank you, Mike, for being here with us. Our following panelist is Dr. Susan Wafels. She is recognized for her international and national leadership in the global ocean observing system, and is regarded as an expert in understanding large-scale multidecadal ocean warming and salinity changes. She currently leads the IMO's Argo Australian facility and is a co-chair of the International Argo Science Team. She's also a member of the IOC UNESCO International Steering Committee for the Global Ocean Observing System. She is a recipient of the Australian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society's Priestley Medal and the Australian Academy of Sciences Dorothy Hill Award. One of our other panelists is Maria Paz Chirichimo. Maria Paz is a physical oceanographer at the Argentine Scientific and Technical Research Council, the CONICET, and the Hydrographic Service in Buenos Aires. Her research focuses on large-scale ocean current changes, their role in distributing heat, salt, and carbon across the ocean, and how they impact climate system. She serves in the Cliver Atlantic Region Panel and the Goose Ocean Observation Physics and Climate, or the OOPC panel. She is the lead author of the IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. And last but not least, Lauren Weatherdon is a senior at the very end. And would you mind, panelists, just putting your names up so the audience sees, well, if you have an eagle's eye, because I can't read that far. Lauren is a senior program officer and interdisciplinary scientist at the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Center, which is based in the UK. She has many years of experience working with multicultural and interdisciplinary communities globally, which cover a wide range of topics from fisheries to blue economy to sustainable development. Her primary interest is in translating marine data and information into knowledge that is useful for decision-making and policymakers, and to connect the science that we do with policy. So thank you all for being here. I will remind our panelists that you have 7 minutes each to provide your views on this subject. I want to make sure that we as an audience have enough time for questions. I also want to remind the audience to please use Slido. I think it's worked pretty effectively, so if you want to submit your questions, please do that. I'll be monitoring them from here and asking the questions. We also created a live poll on data and data accessibility and how we translate those data into actionable information. So if you want to go into Slido and vote, we will go back and look at that poll once we finish with our panel. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Mike if you want to go ahead and start so we can pull up the slides and get started.
Thank you very much, Laura. Yes, Laura invited me to come here and do this. I warned her that I probably wasn't the best person to do it. In the picture in front of you right now, sort of, I guess it's on your right, is a fellow named Lars Bouma, who would have been a far better person, or perhaps Fabien Roquette. Both of these guys are physical oceanographers who've been sort of converted to understanding a lot about the biology, but are still well versed in dealing with the kind of challenges that the data that these animals deliver. So Lars is looking at what he probably sees as a sort of an animated and rather willful Argo float. And in fact, it is that model that this whole process was built on. A biologist will look at the guy on the male elephant seal on the left and see a device for collecting resources from the ocean and turning them into babies. We have very different outside views of what's going on here. However, what I thought might be useful, given that you heard such, I thought, very effective discussions of how we've come to be where we are in terms of now developing data and becoming part of this larger community, I thought I'd give you just a little bit of anecdotal history of how the whole business came about, because the fact that I've been involved in development of the instruments that have been providing a lot of this data right from their inception has given me a slightly different view on some of the problems and also some of the challenges that we have to overcome. One last thing, sort of as a general thing, is that we have to, we feel we are becoming part of this community. We need this community as biologists desperately, but we also think we have a lot of opportunities to help you carry the freight of all the data that you require to do your jobs. So one thing we're trying to avoid now is to avoid the necessity for serendipity in terms of connecting people in different disciplines together. When this whole project started, it happened just because of chance. We were building tags. There was a guy up in, a physical oceanographer up in Svalbard who was interested in the Barents Sea, and we had marine mammals up there, and there were biologists up there in Norwegian polar ice who wanted to learn about them. And it was only because we sat down together, had a conversation, and we saw what the oceanographers really needed. And that was the first step in developing these tags effectively. So that was in about 1990. We developed the tags first in 1990. In 1998, we worked with oceanographers to develop oceanographic sampling tags. And then, interestingly, in a meeting in about 2001, I believe, a RAPID meeting, an oceanographic meeting that was held by NERC in London, I presented the idea, I think, of this to that oceanographic community, and it was greeted with laughter, which was a little bit embarrassing at the time, but it didn't really bother me. In fact, one fellow in the back of the room stood up and said, "You just want our money." And my answer to that question was, yes, of course, we all need money, we all need resources, but we think we can deliver information. I think we've proved now that we're able to do that. We can deliver information that's generally useful. We can pay our way effectively. Very cost effective, effectively. Well, that led to a project that started in 2004 that made wide use of this methodology across groups of people interested in the Southern Ocean in 4 different countries. And that went on to lead to another project, part of the International Geophysical Year 50th sort of anniversary, that led to a MIA project that involved 12 different countries. One thing that wasn't mentioned very clearly in that last talk is sort of the direct reference to how that data is being made available. There is a website called MIOP on which this data is all presented. It's semi-standardized, but it's freely available. It's sort of curated to a reasonable, consistent standard, and it is being widely used. And there's a poster on that, and there are many of the biologists around will be aware of that thing and be able to talk to people about that. I have 2 little examples I want to effectively describe of what I think is, if we could keep that slide on, if possible. I don't know. Right. There's one word in there, and that is to extend the temporal and spatial reach of other approaches. So that's all I think, that's the only point I'm really trying to make here. I don't have much time to make that with the specifics. I would also say reach downward in resolution as well. We can do those things, and we are doing those things. A great example of that I had personal experience is being in an oceanographic ship that sailed from Punta Arenas down to the Amazon Sea. We spent 7 weeks down there. We did a number of fantastic measurements using standard techniques. I had to learn words and terms like potential vorticity. This does not mean a lot to a biologist. But on that ship, we were there for about 6 or 7 weeks. We had to leave, and after we left 14 elephant seals behind that provided over 10,000 profiles spread across the Amundsen Sea, across the Antarctic winter all the way into October. So we very much extended the reach of that project. One other example, which I can barely squeeze in, is one that involves coastal oceanography. We heard a lot about the need for more coastal observations. We're working together in the UK with the Met Office. We're doing seal studies which allow us to, I'll go to the next slide if I can. This kind of tends to show that we've consistently been adding information, but we're working with the Met Office to try to provide information that help them with their forecasting. We're doing studies where we're looking at how seals interact with marine infrastructure, providing detailed behavioral information. At the same time, on those same tags, the Met Office said we need timely information, put an Argos transmitter on that tag so we get fresh, new, less than 48-hour-old information, and we'll include that in our modeling. They're doing that, and they're finding it makes a difference. So I think we're kind of there. The last thing is that we know now that there are a lot of biologists at this meeting. We're among you. Please take advantage of them and talk to them, because there are lots of opportunities. As we learn more about these animals, we are better and better able to target their data collection to places that you might be interested in. And there's generally a good biological question in terms of the animals, because we know not enough about them either. There's an exhibit downstairs called the MAST exhibit. It's the Marine Association for Science and Technology Scotland, that soon-to-be independent country north of the of England. Yeah, me too. But so anyway, there are people down there who will be able to display to you a range of the instrumentation that we use. They range from things like sonar on board seals that allow us to see the fish they're approaching, detailed passive acoustics, detailed acoustic recording, measuring sound levels on the animals, and all these sorts of things. There are people there. I'll try to be there as much as we can to be able to interact with you, and we would love to have those interactions. Anyway, I hope I have generated some interest in adding some questions to the whatever it's called, and just be reassured that all the input we get from you here is going to be valued and I think utilized.
Thank you, Mike.
All right, so the title of this session is Realities and Opportunities. And I think we've heard over the last day comments about how much progress we've made, but I'm going to talk a bit about something really basic where I feel we have a lot of work to do. And so I sort of live in the left-hand side there in one of the networks. You know, I contribute to several different networks, so you could sort of view me as a data provider. And we know that we actually need to turn those observations from all those different networks into information that our users can use. And I think one of the big challenges we're hearing this week is the diversity of those users is going up. So that's a huge challenge to us. But a more fundamental problem we have really, I think, and if I just, is that we have a whole issue with the complexity of obtaining our data. But we have these network data assembly centers that exist for current networks like Argo, the XBT network, the MEOP data system. They're all separate. We have historical archives, some of which pool this data, but a lot of information is lost when that pooling happens. And we have a vast quantity of research data being taken in process studies that actually almost much of it never ends up in the commons. So we already have a major, I think, challenge in doing better with the data streams that we have. So I'm interested in hearing from the audience and looking for actions that can come out over the next 10 years to do this better, to fill in the value chain, the way that Pierre-Yves talked about the tremendous work that's been done in the marine services by Copernicus. There's other projects around. But to do this and to make it easy for the people that produce the gridded products, we need to really get our house in order here. We need to be able to poll those historical archives and all those network DACs to produce an EOV archive that is ready to be science ready or synthesis ready. And even beyond that, we need to assemble real experts in the different platforms, and here I'm talking about from satellite platforms that might measure an EOV through to in situ platforms, to understand how to truly combine those, de-bias them, and put them into an unbiased synthesis. We have this for a few parameters, SST, potentially sea level, but there are many others where we have failed to do this. And I think we thought that by building the networks, this would flow. I think it's quite spotty. And then once we have those synthesis products or those archives that are ready to use, it makes it much easier for those folks that produce the gridded products that eventually our users want to use to do their job. I think right now it's quite difficult to pull data from these many different DACs, and it's happening over and over and over again in different centres around the world. It's incredibly inefficient. So, I would just like to reflect on this right now. Money-wise, we spend a lot of money on the observing system. We all want to have more money spent on the observing system. I'm talking about the truly integrated, I'm talking about the remote sensed parameters as well as the in situ networks. And we actually have, as Pierre-Yves showed, good investment in some of these areas that are generating gridded products. But we spend very little, I would say, on the architecture to really usefully assemble the data from all these different areas. And we spend even less on these expert synthesis teams that know how to combine a wind record from a buoy with a scatterometer record of wind. How does Argo measure SST versus a radiometer of a ship? Some of that's work, we have those expert teams, but for other parameters, we simply don't. And so I think it is really vital that as we proceed into the next decade, not just for our legacy networks, but as we build new networks, we make sure that entire chain is resourced, because that's the only way we are really going to have impact and make it easy for our users. I would say even super users, research users, I'm one myself, it is tremendously difficult to get the MEOP data, to get the Argo data, to get the GoShip data and put it all together. It's been done in some centres, but it's ridiculously difficult, I would say. So there's work in there for the networks, but there's also, I think, potentially within our new Goose framework to think about specialist teams that will do this work for us and really do it very well. I think the opportunity is now for this feedback loop. Not just from the users, but actually also from the folks that populate the value chain, because they tell us where we are doing really well and where we're doing really poorly. And again, as a network operator, we need to find better ways to have that feedback more regularly from the operational centres, from synthesis teams about where we're doing well and where we're not. And so I think that's my main point here. I think there's a reality here that we make it pretty hard for our users, I would say. There's a big opportunity to make it a lot easier and to grow the number of people that are using our observations and the related products. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, Laura. So I am Maria Pachi Chimo, and I am a physical oceanographer working mainly with in situ observations, and I will give my perspective working in Argentina. So the main topic from this panel was how do we transfer ocean observing data into practical information for the different users. So I want to go a bit of a step back into that regarding which information do we have at a regional level. So the main point I want to make is that I think we are all on the same page that we need an observing system that has to be consistent globally. And we know that the ocean is changing, we know there are impacts, and we have robust assessments for global quantities. But then when one goes to the regional level, that is very difficult to quantify, mainly because of the lack of information that we have. So this was said yesterday in one of the panels, and I want to stress this one once more time, is that I think it's really essential to have an observing system that serves local and global needs. And sometimes that is very difficult to transmit at the national level, at least for my country. So for instance, for physical measurements, we know it is really important to measure at the shelves, shelf breaks, the boundary current systems. We can try to explain why that is really important for the country. But then we need to also make the case that those data also serve to global needs in a way, because they help to reduce uncertainties in global quantities. They help to close budgets in heat, fresh water, and that was actually one of the recommendations of one of the white papers, or several white papers. And also the regional data feeds into global products, so linking to what Susan was saying. So this data should also go into global products, reanalysis, models, etc., to improve what we have. Yeah. So I think that for that, what is really essential is to have coordinated international efforts and to convince maybe at a regional level of the need of integrating regional observing systems into bigger international frameworks. And also, as we heard yesterday in one of the panels, it is really important that all the nations participate in the co-design, participate on the science, and also, of course, it's fundamental to share resources. Because there is simply so much more you can do if you work together in collaborations. And of course, there are many challenges. For the value of ocean observing when we want to transmit that, so the results are not immediate. So we need to make a commitment between what is short-term and long-term, which might not be the same for a scientist that for a policymaker. And also, of course, that getting high-quality data is expensive, is time-consuming, and also requires people working on the technical aspects, and in developing nations, that's very difficult. So there is really not much people working on that. Or sometimes they do, but they don't work for a long period of time on the same thing. So it's really important to build capacity to be able to continue with these activities. The second point I wanted to make is that what I would really like to see is to work towards, at the national level, integrating different knowledge systems, which includes scientific, including social scientists, because I think they really can help to make bridges between the data, what the science we do, and then which are the needs of the users. And also the local knowledge, which has not been taken into account much. For instance, for studies over land, for climate change, that has improved in the past years, but for studies for the ocean, that's not really happening yet. So we are starting or trying to collaborate more. For instance, we had a recent experience working with fishermen, and also multi-sectorial approaches to hear different voices. So that's really good, because we really need to learn how to understand each other in a way. Finally, I would like to conclude that I think, at least at the regional level, this is true, and probably it's true for everyone. To really be able to contribute to ocean policy processes, it's really important to improve the link between research, application, policymakers, civil society, and all the users. And I think it is essential to increase the awareness of the importance of the ocean at the national level, of ocean changes and how they can impact. And that also implies that one needs to be able to transmit efficiently the importance of having high quality ocean observations to address many users' needs. And also that includes more synergies to make the data we collect and the information that we extract from the data to make it more accessible to the other users. So I would really like to see that at the regional level we can work on that to improve what we will get for the future. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Just a few thoughts from me, which hopefully complement my colleagues. To begin with, I think for quite some time, there's been sort of a perspective that the data supply chain is quite linear, and we often place businesses and governments at the end of that supply chain as the people who use this and whom we have to convince with the data that we have. And in doing so, I think we've kind of removed them from the process. And in my experience, while this may be true in many respects, in fact, many of the governments and businesses, they're already convinced. They're on the same page as we are in many respects. They recognize the financial and the existential risks that are associated with the loss of shared natural capital, and also the fact that natural capital and many of the things that we measure underpin their business performance. They underpin our ability to meet the Sustainable Development Objectives. So I think as the UN Special Envoy for the Ocean, Peter Thompson, noted yesterday, we cannot leave sustainable development in the coming decades to guesswork. Data underpin many of the fundamental decisions that are made by both governments and by businesses in terms of not only in terms of, I guess we're focusing on throughout the entire supply chain, things in relation to data for locating sustainable development opportunities or coordinating or reviewing environmental impact assessments. They're much kind of two sides of the same coin. In doing so, I think we really need to focus on the fact that they can only act if they have the knowledge to do so. And we're really critical to that process, but we also need to be communicating with them much more regularly. Governments and businesses are more than just the end of the supply chain. They play critical roles in the digital ecosystem of data, as partners, as decision makers, and as data providers in many cases. In particular, I would argue that we need to create space for businesses. We're missing an opportunity to really engage with them as partners in innovation and as those with experience and knowledge on many of the things that we're struggling with, such as these supply chains and how we really give back to the data providers. When it comes to data, I would also note that I think, and I feel a bit bashful saying this to a room full of brilliant minds, but I would almost argue that we need to go back to basics. A question that keeps coming up, emerging when we're talking to governments and businesses, is where are ocean habitats and how are they changing? And while I know that many of us are working on this through our work at multiple scales, ourselves included, we need to find a way to incentivize and invest in a mandated process for data collection and management. I think some of my colleagues have hinted at this here too, to ensure that we have the key data that are required for the comprehensive baseline that has been mentioned yesterday. This is what we need. It's amazing to me, at least, that however many years down the line, we still can't answer some of these basic questions. And again, that's sort of a network issue, that's a governance issue. And from my perspective, one of the reasons why we are on track to reach the global protected areas target in terms of coverage is because we've had a concerted effort to advance the CBD mandated World Database on Protected Areas, which has been developed in collaboration with organizations and with countries. frameworks such as the IUC UNESCO Global Ocean Observing System, Essential Ocean Variables, can help us to focus our attention and resources on key aspects that we should be able to measure by the time 2029 rolls around. And in essence, the WDPA gave, or the World Database on Protected Areas, gave a barometer of progress for people to rally around. And I think we need the ocean equivalent for many of the things that we're focusing on. So just to summarize, I suppose in my last few moments, governments and businesses play critical roles. I think that the supply chain we talk about is much more of a holistic cycle rather than a linear trajectory. In addition to using data, they also provide data. We mentioned capacity building. I think that's a critical aspect, that not only do we need to work with governments in order to supply them with data, but we need to ensure that they have the capacity to be able to use that data and that they in turn have their own national inventories of data for use. And then that key message that businesses as well, can only act on what they know. And so I think we hold them really to account in situations where they may not have the information they need to act knowingly. So again, this is very much a two-way system. And finally, to answer their key questions, I think as a community of practice, if we can really focus on establishing mandated data sets as global public goods, that help us to advance progress towards these comprehensive baselines that we need throughout the UN Decade on Ocean Science and beyond. So that would be a couple of key thoughts that come to mind, but I'm looking forward to hearing the questions, so thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists. Please, if you can submit your questions through Slido, we will read them out. If you are technologically challenged, like I am, just ask your neighbor for their phone, and that way you're also going to be networking. So we're going to kick it off with one of the Slido questions that I thought some of the questions are phenomenal, so thank you. Keep it coming. One of the questions, and panelists, feel free to take turns or raise hands or just struggle with each other to answer this. It really goes down to some of the issues that we've been hearing about, and the question says, how do we pull together data from nations with diverse data sharing policies and constraints? Who wants to take that first?
Well, I can try.
Maria Paz, go ahead.
I don't know if it is for me, but it's really difficult. I mean, so there are specific programs that have a specific data sharing policy. So when we participate in those programs, we stick to that policy. And then there is, at least from Argentina, there is a national program that connects all the institutions, handles ship time, etc. But then what really happens is that institutions tend to decide on what they do with the data, or how long does they take for them to release them. But there have been really huge efforts in the last 2 years through this national program to go through a unified system for all the countries so that everybody complies with the same rules for data sharing. But we are not there yet, but at least Argentina is working on that. I don't know.
Any other comments?
Build on that. In terms of the data sharing requirements within countries, I'm going to take the World Database on Protected Areas as one example, because I'm familiar with it, but there's been a lot of focus on trying to work with the countries so that the data, at the end of the day, if you talk about, we were talking earlier about data repatriation, but the data, in essence, are a national asset, and countries are thinking about their national priorities. So, I mean, in this way, in WDPA, it works really well because we view it as a global data set, and yet really what it is, it's a set of national data that are aggregated upwards, that have been standardized so that they're compatible in a way that works really well for reporting at a global scale, but that are equally critical for national operations. And so I think there's something to be learned from that, in that we're not taking the data essentially away from the countries, we're helping the countries to build the capacity internally so they can manage that data set, their own individual one, and so that they can then report that at the global sphere with regards to the SDGs, with regards to Aichi targets. So it's sort of, again, it's this data repatriation. How do we bring the data to the countries so that it sits with them, but is still compatible for the needs that we have at multiple scales? So that's kind of how I would answer that.
Sort of looking at this problem from a completely opposite direction, from the bottom upward, I guess I sense the complexity of the problem, because what I'm acutely aware of is the fact that in terms of one of the things, the easiest ways to make things more usable is to standardize them in some way. But because our fundamental problem in the way we gather data deals with a bandwidth issue, we have to carefully focus the bits we send to the user to answer the specific questions they're trying to answer. So right from the start, we're sort of varying the kind of data that's being put into the databases. And I was made acutely aware at the meetings we had early in the biological group, the 2 days prior to this meeting, that the simple-minded idea of just having sufficient metadata associated with those data streams to make it so that they're future-proof. Anyone in the future can look at them, see exactly how they were put together, and then do the hard work themselves to do it. That's never going to cut it. And I think the process of getting up to this upper layer is going to involve the multi-layered process of data. Don't call it standardization, just call it a sort of presentation. So you have sort of a layer of different layers of products that are useful to different peoples in different communities. I mean, if we had a magic and a truly benign Google out there who could set up an agent that could look at this pure metadata-rich data set and then respond to requests from the users and go run around in there and sort these things out and then present the little specific package they need, that would be wonderful. You know, how do we approach that? How do we get to that kind of a situation with data that necessarily has these very complicated underpinnings and user requirements? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'll just say it's quite a problem.
Thank you. Actually, let me build on that last comment that you made, Mike, and ask actually one of the questions. Are there any examples from other disciplines that we can go back and look and maybe borrow to build a truly integrated, interdisciplinary, integrated data repository, data synthesis platform?
I'm curious about the medical field, actually. I think there's some, I mean, there are a lot of standards that have been developed over the last maybe 20 years beyond in terms of data. But I'm wondering, given that the rigor required for medical industry, you know, also other businesses, also the finance sector, the natural capital lens, for instance, they're trying to look at how do you take habitats, for instance, and how do you put them in tabular form and understand how they're changing over time? A lot of these things we can't answer yet, but there are ways in which that we can at least draw from and maybe potentially adapt to our own circumstances, our own requirements. But this is perhaps where we need to start bringing in other, you know, industry and other experts so that we can, you know, think outside the box a little bit. Maybe this is the time to do it because, again, we have a lot of technology available to us now. So there's a lot of exciting opportunities, I think, on the horizon. But.
Thank you. And actually, Lauren, let me follow up with something that you mentioned about industry and the data repatriation and the fact that data are national assets. What do you think, what role do you think governments and industry play in the ocean observing realm? And do they have a role in this, in building this infrastructure that we've talked about, or this bigger thing?
I think I think they're essential and, to be honest, central to it, because a lot of the things that we've discussed over the last day or so, a lot of things that are in discussion in the community is how do we ensure that the data have societal benefit? So even though I've mentioned that we often view businesses and governments as users, they are, but they're also partners in this. And if we are looking at the UN Decade on Ocean Science, UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, many of the objectives for the coming decade are holistic and are across all spheres. So I think to answer the question in the best I can, I think governments and businesses, they need to be at least sitting at the table and they need to have an opportunity to really engage, and they have. I mean, I think many of us sort of question whether they've given us their priorities. I would argue they have with some of the, through these Sustainable Development Goals, many of them are abstract in fairness. Through regional Cs, there's a lot of indicators that have been proposed. there's an opportunity for this community to really step up and say, this is what we should be measuring, and these are kind of the critical requirements for the coming decade. So I'll leave it at that. But
Thank you. Susan, maybe you can talk about a little bit about the reality of ocean observing funding, of data archiving or database funding, and maybe you can speak a little bit about how to promote the funding of synthesis of EOVs.
I mean, I think we need a set of conversations and I guess a hard look at what we're doing to understand the information flow and where we have problems or hurdles to overcome. And so I think, you know, we love to pretend we have a blank check and say there's all this great new technology and new parameters and things like that, and different ways that we want to grow the observing system. But we also have a responsibility to be efficient and to review how we're doing. And I feel we do that well in some cases, but pretty poorly in other cases. And so one of the areas that I think, as I said in my talk, we need to look at that entire chain of the data streams coming out of the networks and how that flows into really usable products, similar to what Mike was saying at different levels. And, you know, I think there's a role for our international organizations, Goose, IOC, WMO, they already do some of those things. But I think we've got to take on a greater role of reviewing what we're doing, and also this issue of priorities is central, right? So the success or the value of what we're doing, and the framework tells us this, is we need to know the requirements. The requirements should be setting our priorities, not so much push from people that are pushing their own particular idea. And it's a simple idea, but do we really apply that to what we're doing? We're getting there, but we have a long way to go. And so, you know, we need to make sure that we don't put the cart before the horse, right? We need to really understand the priorities and where governments see common ground to invest and help us, the people that do this stuff, to prioritize. And it has to involve not just the networks, but that entire value chain. Yep.
Thank you. Let me follow up with something as building off of what you said about having conversations and making sure that stakeholders are at the table. Do you think there's room for an Indigenous ocean expert group, since we also heard a lot about that yesterday, to be part of the Goose data value chain?
Sorry, the Indigenous groups?
An Indigenous ocean expert.
Yes, I struggle to understand because of, I guess, my background, how we expand the conversation around stakeholder needs. Truly, at the end of the day, it is going to be national governments that decide where and how much to invest their very overtaxed revenues, right? And so, you know, we, I think, need to find some way of organising those discussions between governments and across different sectors. And I think that's a big gap that we currently have in our organisation. Where do those conversations happen across different sectors and between governments to find the common ground where they are ready to invest? And then look at, can we design that fit-for-purpose observing system that ticks the maximum number of boxes? So I think that's one of our big challenges now. Yeah.
Thank you. Mike, let me ask you something that our audience has asked. Specifically going back to animals as platforms for observations, ocean observations. Do you know if it has been calculated, the relative cost of, say, equipping an elephant seal or deploying an Argo float? And let me tack up another one on that. Do you see specific areas where animal tagging is especially useful in areas that are undersampled? And we've discussed the polar oceans as one of those areas. Do you think there are other critical areas that we should be looking at?
Coastal oceans. I mean, it's the obvious one that's come up again and again here. I think the question of the cost versus value argument for the different ways of collecting is not as simple as one as you might say. I could give you a cost per profile, but that doesn't really tell you anything. You know, it's the inherent value in the profile, and that value is based on a set of different purposes to which that information is being put. So I don't think there's a simple way to do that. I mean, it's certainly, I think, in terms of sort of extending some approaches to parts of the globe where there is not a great oceanographic infrastructure, the tags have real value in that situation because they are relatively cheap. And you need a biologist or someone to help you sort of put the tag on. You don't want to start off trying to drug an elephant seal if you've never done it before without any guidance, I can assure you. But with that proviso, it's relatively easy to do, to apply wherever the animals are in a position to help. And as the size of the tags decreases and stuff, that they become applicable to more and more different types of animals. And so that, I think there's a growth in that sort of ability. And that's a very good thing. We'll be able to do things a little bit easier.
Thank you. That's really encouraging to hear. And I'll tag up what you just said on coastal regions with another questions that we have, which is how do we better coordinate and have more focus on coastal observation? So perhaps expanding the animal tagging effort could be one of them. And especially in the Pacific, where a lot of nations are underdeveloped or in the ways of development, and there are a lot of small island states. And I'll tag on the role of business and governments in here too. So this kind of can be a multifaceted question that I'm hoping I can pick the expertises of the panel on how do we expand coastal observations? Do we integrate those data better to serve all the different nations across, for example, the Pacific? And what roles do governments and businesses play on this?
For me?
It's for anyone's take to begin.
Go, sir.
Okay. That's a giant question,
I'm
right?
sorry. I have to find.
And we have been struggling with that for a very long time. My feeling is, there is a tremendous amount of information already available to many countries, and we fail, I feel, to help them access it and use it. And so there's already global satellite systems. There are products that many countries, Copernicus is just one. And so there are already, there's a lot of information that we could present. I think the key question is, and I think we discussed this, is having in-country experts and users that are knowledgeable enough and can use that information. And so, making that link between the local observations and those gridded products and services that are coming forth is super important. And there's a great deal that can be done using, I think, robust, simple technologies that can assist with that. And so, I think we have, through the WMO, really, one interesting model of how countries collaborate to produce global data sets and services. That's one model that, I think in the physics we're already sort of following. I think in the biological and other areas, it might not be the right model because there might not be a clear agency that one links up with to do that. But I think we can already probably do a lot of good by informing and assisting many countries that there is already a lot of ocean information that they can use. I think the coastal gap is a really huge challenge. I don't know if I'm the right person to address that one. I think one of the toughest aspect about that is, again, trying to settle on what are the key priorities, what are the key things that you're trying to do with the coastal observing system, and look across regions to see if there's commonalities, so that similar infrastructures, should there be similar infrastructures across different areas, so that a more global view of the coastal seas could be built. And I don't know how, I think that conversation is an important one.
Thank you.
I could add a little comment. Sorry.
Lauren, do you want to go ahead, Lauren?
Yeah.
I guess building on that then, I'm not going to pretend that it's not a minefield. I think it's a really challenging question, and something that I think all of us have different experiences at different scales of how to address that. So again, it's something that as a community we can help to work towards. One example that comes to mind, if you think of a national context, is the challenges within a country. It could be manifold. You could have different government departments with different mandates for holding different data sets. It might be quite hierarchical, quite difficult to get access to those data. So every time you get a new data set, you have to submit a new request. And that's just within country. If you're then talking about scaling it up or sharing with other users, it does, it multiplies. And I think then you have the NGOs, you have businesses who also hold data. So what we're talking about is, there's a reason why it hasn't been achieved in a smooth, flawless approach yet. But if you do focus on the national context and on capacity development in the national context, there are a lot of people who are spending time and investing in that process, and I think a lot of them are actually in this room. So it'd be really interesting to see how we can kind of use those sort of circumstances to find these common best practices, and then figure out at a national scale what works, and what are some of those high-level or maybe low-hanging fruits that we can get for then aggregating upwards where needed or elsewhere. So I don't know, it's not a simple answer, but.
Did you want to add?
Yeah, well, I think I'm the bottom feeder here, in the sense I'm coming up from the end of it. When we get asked questions, basically, very often, and that kind of directs us to what sort of an approach we use to answer those questions. They come from government, they come from businesses, they come from a range of sort of social questions associated that are provided by government as well. And our trick, I guess, in dealing with this range of questions is to have the expertise handy to figure out the best sets of observations to apply to those questions, and that's certainly what we do. And as we're doing it, we often try to answer blue skies or blue water, I guess, questions at the same time to get sort of spin-off value out of those questions. And I don't think we're in a position really, from where I sit, in building instruments and deploying them to direct, to determine those questions, except until our information goes up to a much higher level. So we sit at the bottom of this change are responding, and we certainly try to respond to whatever comes our way, and that's about all I think we can do, at the level of the instrument.
Thank you. And unfortunately, our time has run. Eric is about to throw that paddle at me. Or the panelists? No. So please help me in thanking our panelists once more. Thank you. And so as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, we had a poll, which we're going to pull up at the screen right now. One of the thing that most participants have felt that is a barrier to actually getting observational data out for fit for purpose information is data accessibility. I would encourage all of you to look at the poll as you walk out for lunch now. Think about this when you go into your breakout sessions after lunch. So as a reminder, we have about an hour and a half for break now. There are several kiosks throughout the convention center, or you can find lunch outside. Lunch is on your own. Please try to be back here at 2 p.m. promptly. There are 7 breakout sessions that you can sort yourselves out in. There are descriptions on the program if you aren't sure where you're going. And I want to thank you all again for being here this morning. Thanks again.
Thank you, Laura, for an awesome panel.
Where's the music as you know?
So everyone, back in the convention center at 1:30, I encourage you to look in on the exhibits and posters over lunch as well. The exhibitors would like to see people all day long, so take some time to stop by as early as 8 o'clock in the morning and during the poster session this afternoon. So there's 7 breakout sessions on the 3rd floor after lunch and 1 session in here. So please make a decision and be back on time.